Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 2 of the HSG Top 100 Countdown, my 100 favourite vehicles as of 2020, and as I mentioned in the intro video yesterday, we're going to be basically covering 30 vehicles at a time, and then the final episode will be my top 10. But we're not going to get into a set order until pretty much the last 2 episodes, so once we reach the 40th car down to number 1, those will be in order, whereas these ones, not so much, because when you get up to like, oh, what's my 91st favourite car? What's my 87th favourite? It's not really that accurate. Those kind of cars are going to move around and change all the time, so I'm not even trying to make this part of the list in any kind of order. So, without any further ado, let's get straight into it with number 100. And for me, the first car on the list is actually a classic, the Maserati Zagato Coston version of the 450S. This is a relatively obscure car, and I will freely admit that the primary reason why it is in my top 100 is purely because of its design. I love the look of this car. It's such a unique, certainly polarizing vehicle in terms of design, especially from the back end. They did make a modern interpretation of this as well in concept form, but to me, I just love this car ever since I first saw it. I love the 300S, I love the Maserati 450S, this one even more. Next up we have the first Formula car on the list, the Benetton B186, one of only a few Grand Prix machines that I would classify myself as loving, and again, just like how I love the design of the Maserati, this one I purely love because it's the most powerful Formula car of all time. 1500 horsepower in qualifying form, which is insane, especially from a 1.5 litre turbo BMW engine. Next up on the list we have a car which I have a lot of love for. It's one of my favourite sports cars, and that is the primary reason why it's here, the Cadillac XLR. Great alternative to the Porsche 911, especially of the 996 generation, and the Mercedes SL of the time as well. You could argue maybe a Panoz Esperante convertible rival to some degree, but I've always loved the design of this Cadillac. I'm a huge Cadillac fan overall, and you will see plenty more on this list, even as we get into the higher numbers. And this one to me, it's one of those cars which out of my top 100, I may actually try to own one day. Although it would mean importing it from the States, because as far as I know, they didn't actually sell them officially over here. Next up we have the first of only 2 Koenigsegg's to feature on this list, and this one is the original. I love the pure original design and that NASCAR-derived engine which the original Koenigsegg CC8S has. Now technically it's not the first Koenigsegg, that's the Koenigsegg CC, but that car isn't exactly pretty. This one to me is where it all came together. I love the front lights, which are like no other Koenigsegg since. It does have some more than subtle differences compared to the CCR, and certainly every other Koenigsegg after that. And again, I love that raw 650 horsepower engine, which it has. Next up, staying in the exotic world, the Volkswagen W12, but in particular the W12 Synchro, because there are at least 3 distinct variants of the W12. There's the Nardo, which is the most famous, and that's the one that actually set the speed record at Nardo. Then there's this one, the Synchro, which is, you could argue, closer to a production version, and then there's also the W12 Roadster, which is the sister car to this one. Now the Roadster would be my favourite if it had better specs, but for instance if you look on Test Drive Unlimited as an example, there's a pretty big disparity between the two. This one's my favourite for a number of reasons. I love the choice of yellow, I love the subtle changes in bodywork compared to the Nardo version, especially the front bumper, and I absolutely adore that blue interior. I wish more cars had that. I love red and blue and those kind of crazy coloured interiors. And like I said, I wish more vehicles would do that. Next up, we go from a couple of hypercars and supercars to a K-car, a Daihatsu. In fact, the first of 2 Daihatsus, and most of you guys already know what the other one's going to be, but this one to me is a car which I've loved more in recent years, the Daihatsu Move, the SRXX in particular, a small, automatic, turbocharged K-car. It has great headroom so that even someone like me could drive it comfortably. It's not as quick as certain other K-cars, but I love the fact that this is basically the most sleeper-esque Daihatsu K-car they've ever built. It has the same kind of spec as stuff like the Core Avanzato and those others like that, the Suzuki Alto Works, Mitsubishi Minica, all that kind of thing, but this one has just total sleeper appeal. Next up, a car which you probably would not expect to be this far down on the list, the Toyota GT1 road car. I know a lot of you guys would put it way higher than the first 30 vehicles, but for me, the Toyota GT1 is in the lower end of the list because of the fact that just like that Maserati Zagato Costin, it's mostly the design of this car that I love. I've never been a massive fan of the race car. Actually, I've always been more of a Minolta guy than a Toyota GT1 kind of guy. But for the road car, I think it's easily the most exotic car ever to come out of Japan. Certainly one of the most exclusive. The performance is phenomenal. It looks like the racing equivalent of a Batmobile in a kind of opposite way to how the Panos looks like a Batmobile as well. Next up, another choice which you might not expect to be here, but in recent years especially, I've come to love a lot of more normal cars as well, cars which you can actually buy, and this is another car which I've personally considered buying, the Mercedes GL. I'm not a huge fan of the G-Wagon. I think it's a fairly overpriced vehicle, typically speaking, although I understand in the case of the AMG. This one though, I love it. To me, it's what the ML wished it could be. It's this full-size Range Rover level vehicle. I love the look, I love the design. The GL 420 overall is probably my favourite because it's not crazy expensive like the AMGs, but it's got a beefy engine. I love the 7-seat layout. To me, it's an excellent rival to the Audi Q7, and yeah, I just love it. I think it's a great real-world car. Next up, we have the only Dodge Viper to feature on my list, the original, in a similar way to how I have a lot of love for the original, smooth, pure design of the Koenigsegg. It's the same for me with the Viper. I like the fact that it doesn't have stripes. I love the Targa top. There are precious few cars that have that these days. And I actually kind of like the fact that it has a little bit less power. It has more of a pure sports car vibe, whereas the later cars became more super sport level machines, borderline supercars. I prefer the Viper as a sports car. I also kind of like that chunky, plasticky, almost real life-size Hot Wheels toy vibe that the car has. And I would actually argue that the Viper could well be America's last new proper hot rod, or at least the proper successful hot rod, and what a success it was, even though of course it's gone away now. Next up on the list, we have another American car, another car which I love the design of, the Cobra. The Shelby or the AC, I love them both to be honest. Once again, in particular without stripes. I love it in black, solid black that is, or solid silver. Love the 427. I love the 289 as well, but you can't beat that steroided muscle that the 427 shape has. Next up, in a similar way to the Daihatsu Move, probably a car that some people won't really have on their lists, I suspect, the Aston Martin Signet. I know some of you guys do love this one. I love the fact that it exists at all. And even though, of course, Aston Martin made it because they have to, in a similar way to their new SUV, the DBX, ironically enough, I actually love the fact that this even exists. It's a crazy idea to have an Aston Martin hatchback anyway. Yes, it's just a Toyota underneath, but regardless, it's a fantastic little collector's piece. It's one of the most affordable ways to get an Aston, or at least something with an Aston badge, and it's arguably the most practical Aston Martin as well, considering the low prices, well, running prices, not buying prices, low insurance, and it's pretty practical and it's frugal as well. Next up we have one of the major concept cars on the list, alongside stuff such as the Nardo from earlier, the Maserati Birdcage. To me, a stunning looking machine. I believe one of the guys who designed the car, or the designer possibly, actually designed the SSC Tuatara as well, which, spoiler alert, is going to be on this list as well, and you can clearly see the connection between the two. I love the fact that it has that canopy design, hence the name. The performance would have been fantastic, and I think it's a shame that a car like this never really had its chance. The MC12 is an incredible supercar, but this one would have been more of a, you could even argue, hypercar level Maserati, and I believe that would have been cool. Next up we have a car which some of you may not be familiar with. You might think you are, the Shelby Daytona Cobra, but in actual fact it's not. This is actually the Renovo Daytona Coupe, which is an all-electric version of the Daytona Cobra Coupe. As I've mentioned before, I believe the Daytona Cobra is quite possibly my single favourite car design of all time. Not my favourite car, but my favourite car design in terms of just how purely beautiful it is to me. It's one of those cars that I would not change a single thing about. And to me, the idea of taking that, such an iconic design, a legend, even though not the most successful of legends in racing, and making it a fully electric, modernised idea, to me that's a great combination, and even that is something that I've talked about a lot on the channel, taking old school and new school and putting them together. Next up, much like the Mercedes GL, this is more of a grounded in reality kind of pick. Of course, I love Maserati, they're my favourite brand overall, and the Levante had to be on the list for me. The Levante is another car which I could happily live with every day. It's got the kind of practicality that I like in a performance car. My favourite version would not be like the Trofeo or anything like that. It would actually be one of the more, say, entry-level versions, because to me, I don't always need the fastest version of something to enjoy it. And that's a common theme that you'll see from a number of cars on this list. Next up, a car which some of you who watch the top 50 would probably be expecting to be a lot higher than this. The Ascari A10. The Ascari A10 is a car which I've always loved, but I realised over time, and certainly when compiling this list basically, that yes, I love it, but I wouldn't necessarily put it on the same kind of love pedestal as many of the other cars that I do love and would actually like to own. For me, the Ascari A10 was never a car that I wanted to actually own, partially because you can't, but it was more of a car that I had this insane level of respect for because of how bonkers it was. To me, it does everything the Gumper Apollo can do and then some, plus it's way better looking to me. So yeah, it certainly deserves a place on the list, but it's nowhere near as high as it was. Next up on the list we have one of my personal favourite hot hatches, and there are a number of hot hatches on this list. In fact, this has always been one of my favourites, the Renault Megane R26, in particular in yellow with as minimal stickers as possible. I'm not a fan of all the F1 stickers all over it. I like it to be just almost like a sleeper version. It's a borderline sleeper spec that I like, just a yellow Megane. The R26 is hardcore enough, but I don't necessarily love the R26R as much. I like that mix of hardcore, but it's still a usable, basically practical daily driver, and I like it for that. Next up, another returning face from my top 50, but now of course a lot lower on the list as well, the Van Wall. In a very similar way to the Ascari A10, this is mostly a car that I love to use, like in racing games and that kind of thing, but the fact that you can't actually buy one, there was only one built, the fact that it's a car which has no practicality at all, it's a pure toy, and of course that's the point. But I don't think it's ever the kind of car that I would actually dream of owning. It's just a car that I like a lot, and to me that automatically means it has to be fairly low on the list. Next up we have technically another Viper, even though I said there's only one Viper on the list. This one though is based on the Viper. It was the car that was planned to continue the Viper lineage after the Viper went away, because, as I said, it is based on, it has, I believe, the same chassis, certainly the same engine, the Devon GTX. Those of you who remember the Forza 4 days will certainly remember this car. It was one of a few kind of weird supercars from that game, but it was a brilliant one. Of course, it's based on a Viper ACR, so it's gonna be fast. It's got like 640 horsepower from that V10 engine, incredible performance, and it just allowed, to me at least, the Viper to fully become an actual supercar, like an unarguable supercar, because it had the full package. More exclusivity, more of a supercar design, and just, there's something about it which, I guess, just appealed to me. Next up we have the first of a couple of Lamborghinis to be on my list, and this one of course is a car that I've talked about before, a car which we should be getting in GT Sport, or at least Gran Turismo in general at some point, the Espada. I love the Espada. Once again, it's got that classic practicality meets performance kind of vibe. I considered putting the Isso Grifo on the list, but actually that one's gone from my top 100 now. But overall, this to me fills the exact same void that that car does. The 2+2 long distance GT from back in the day. I love the design of this car, especially from the front. It's just a unique Lambo, and I wish that they would make a modern interpretation of something like this, like a four-seater Gallardo kind of thing. Next up we have a newcomer to the list, and a car which I've certainly spoken about recently on the channel, and even over months, as far back as reviewing it in Forza, the Kia Stinger. Kia is a brand which I've had a lot of respect for some time. Hyundai as well with the Genesis Coupe, which first caught my attention. This one though, to me, is easily the most impressive development that Kia's had in recent years. The Stinger is a car which I don't like as much as the German rivals. I like it more. It's one of the only cars of this type to be on my list at all. I love the value, I love the performance, I love the style, and I love the deal that Kia is offering. Plus the fact that it's a Kia is kind of subversive, and I enjoy that. It's one of the same reasons why I love high-performance Skodas, because you don't expect that, and that makes it cool. Next up, speaking of subversive performance, we have, of course, a car which I've always loved, one of my favourite hot hatches again, the Fiat Panda 100 HP. Another car which some of you might scratch your head at. Why on earth would that be in the top 100 list? Well, put simply, I think it's one of the best small hot hatches ever built. Performance isn't going to melt your face, it's 100 horsepower, 0 to 60 is about 9.5 seconds. But it can do about 45 miles per gallon. It's small, it's practical, they're not particularly expensive second-hand, and I love the look of it. It's understated but sporty enough. I love it in that metallic grey. And yeah, Evo magazine shares my opinion because they absolutely loved this car when it came out as well. So yeah, I love the Panda. It's always going to be in one of my top, probably 10 favourite hot hatches ever, maybe even top 5. Next up, going from one extreme to the literal opposite, from a Fiat Panda to a Hummer. The Hummer H1 in particular, I love the Alpha in its pickup form, the 4-door pickup version, which has recently been added again in Forza Horizon 4. It was in, I believe, the first Horizon game, if I recall correctly. I love the Alpha, the full-bodied SUV as well, but there's something about the pickup which I really like. I like the proportions of it. I think it looks better as a pickup truck, and it's actually one of my dream car projects. There are very few cars that I would like to own which I would have any plan to modify or tune in any way. I like to just let a car be what it already is. A Hummer, though, is one of the cars that I would like to modify. I would love to buy a Hummer H1 Alpha in that pickup truck form, and I would love to completely gut out the engine, the gearbox, basically all of the drivetrain, and replace it with 4 Tesla P90D motors and make it like a 2,000 horsepower all-electric Hummer. Fill the engine bay with lithium-ion batteries and make it just this shockingly quick all-electric Hummer. To me, it's such like an antithesis car, and that's why I love it as well. It stands out like a sore thumb, but it's also faster than anyone would ever think, and to me, that's more than enough to keep it in my top 100. Next up, we have a car which, again, some of you might not expect on the list, and spoiler alert, one of only 2 Ferraris to feature in my top 100, a car which I've gained more love for in recent years, the California, which ironically is a car that I did not initially like. And before you ask, no, I'm not a fan of the California T, much in the same way that I am not a fan of the Ferrari Lusso over the FF. I prefer the original purity that the California has. I love the style. To me, it's the most Aston Martin-ish Ferrari that they'd done at that time, that more long-distance kind of vibe. And you guys can kind of tell from many of my picks, I like a car that has slightly lazier performance, but plenty of power, plenty of speed, and also more of an inclination towards comfort and long-distance performance, rather than just a track toy. Next up, one of the only Porsches to feature on my list, and of course many of you would hope that it would be in my top 100, and of course it would be, the Carrera GT. Some of you might be hoping that it was higher than the top 30 cars, or at least the last 30 cars I should say, but of course the Carrera GT has to be here. Once again though, I do find in a weird kind of way that the Carrera GT is more the type of car that I love to use in racing games, rather than a car that I would actually want to own in real life. I don't think I would ever buy a Carrera GT, even if I could afford to, because it's just not that kind of car for me. I like it a lot, but it's not one of my absolute favourites. Hence why it's on the list, but in episode 2. Next up though, moving from the Porsche Carrera GT way down the food chain again to the second Kia on the list. 2 Ferraris and 2 Kias in my top 100, and 2 Daihatsus as well. You can certainly say that my list is eclectic if nothing else, but this one is a car which I actually fell in love with thanks to Forza once again, the Kia Forte Coupe SX, I believe it is. To me, an excellent little rival to some of the JDM front-wheel drive coupes like the Levin, the Toyota Levin, the newer one, even something like an Integra, you could say. Not fully, but you get the idea. That small, compact, I believe it's 2.4 litre naturally aspirated engine. I love the look of it. It's such a funky little car, and I wish that they'd sold these in the UK, but unfortunately, just like the Hyundai Genesis Coupe, for whatever reason, they don't sell them here, and I think that's a real shame. Next up, a car which, when I tell you what it bumped off the list, you might think I'm crazy, but this position was going to be a Bugatti either way. The Bugatti Royale. This is one of my favourite vintage cars, it's one of my favourite vintage car designs, and it is by far my favourite Bugatti. In fact, it's the only Bugatti in my top 100, because it bumped off the EB110, and I know that for many people that would not make any sense, but I am such a huge vintage car fan, especially when it comes to their design, and the Royale is such a ridiculously ostentatious, over-the-top car that it manages to be, in effect, a car that should be more insulting than a Hummer to look at, just a reminder to everyone else on the road of how poor they are. And yet the Royale is an incredible looking car. I love how enormously over the top the size is, and to me I would love to make a modern interpretation of a beast like this with like some massive V16 engine. I love it. Of course it's my favourite Bugatti, and ultimately it just had to bump the EB110 off for me. Next up we return once again to Cadillac though, after the XLR, this time to the CTS-V, but not the generation of CTS-V which you might be thinking, because the CTS-V has gradually gotten better and better over the years to the point where it is easily an AMG Mercedes level machine, and that's the interesting thing, it kind of always has been. Cadillac to me is the American Mercedes, and the V models are most certainly the AMG equivalents. The reason why I love this generation in particular though, from the earlier 2000s, is I love that 400 horsepower 5.7 litre LS V8 engine, which I believe is basically a Corvette unit if I recall correctly, and I also love the style. I really like the look of this generation of CTS-V, in fact even more so than the newer ones. Even though I have no doubt that the newer cars are better, this one just appeals to me, and I love the used prices as well. Once again, it is the kind of car that I may actually try to import at some point, but we'll have to wait and see. Next up we have, I believe, the second Mercedes of the list so far, and also a car which many of you would probably place considerably higher, and somewhat ironically, this actually used to be my favourite car when I was a kid, the CLK GTR, but the road version in particular, not the Super Sport. The Roadster for a time I loved even more so, but for me, it goes back to the coupe. I do still love the Roadster, but I love the coupe. It's such an iconic car, one of the most iconic homologation cars, one of the most exclusive Mercedes models ever made, and I believe when it was actually released in the late 90s, I think if I recall correctly, it was the most expensive car on the market, maybe even ever made. So, a pretty important car, certainly a very fast one. Next up, our second to last vehicle, and spoiler alert, this is the last Porsche that's going to be on the list. The Panamera, of all things, but not just any Panamera, because many of you will know I was not a fan at all of the Panamera for quite some time, and the main reason why is because to me, it needed to be this. The Sport Turismo is what the Panamera always should have been, a full-on wagon. It already has that shape, just embrace it. That's what Porsche did, it has a stunning interior. Again, I don't even need it to be the top-of-the-range turbo, if anything, I actually like the styling of the lower models even more. And to me, I just love it. I think it's easily the best looking Porsche that's currently on sale, for my money. And yeah, it's certainly justified for me to be in the list. And the final, but definitely not least car of episode 2, in effect, number 71 on the list, if you will, a Venturi. Many of you know that I have a lot of love for Venturi. I used to love the 400 GT even more, France's answer to the Ferrari F40 in other words. But this one, there's just something about it which is more enduring for me. If I had the option of owning a Venturi, it would be this one. And I actually saw one for sale once, only once here in the UK, in a classic car magazine back in probably like 2005. It was for sale for £20,000 and it was a green one. It's basically France's answer to the Lotus Esprit, except I like it more than the Lotus Esprit. It's this interesting little, I believe V6 Peugeot-sourced engine, something like that if I recall, around 300 horses, great performance for what it is, and not insanely expensive either, given just how exclusive Venturis are. And overall, that's it for the second installment, from the 100th car down to number 71, as I said, in no particular order, so take all of these with a pinch of salt, of course. There are certainly cars on the list which I would place higher. Out of these 30 vehicles, a Venturi isn't actually number 71, for instance. But overall, that's it for this roundup. Tell me your thoughts down below. Are there particular ones here that you love? Are there any cars that surprised you that were so low compared to last time, or surprised that they're on the list at all? And of course, slap some of your favourites down below as well. But of course, I'll see you tomorrow with the next episode. And until then, I'll see you next time. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.